Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. Today, I'm bringing you episode 15 in my series on books I loved to teach. This is a series that I've created in order to talk about some of the works that I particularly loved teaching in my almost 40-year career as a high school English teacher. Today, I'd like to talk about Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, a novel that I taught in AP English literature for many years. As it is currently Jane Austen July, I thought that this might be an appropriate time to talk about this beloved novel. We're also observing this year Jane Austen's 250th birthday. In a letter to her sister Cassandra, Jane Austen referred to the book Pride and Prejudice as her darling child, and she called her protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, as delightful a character as ever appeared in print. Jane Austen's work seems little touched by political events in her world or by major literary trends of her day. She focuses instead on themes of social class, middle class manners, gender issues, courtship, and marriage, all of which come together in Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice can be called a comedy of manners, written over several years at the end of the 18th century. It was first written, the first draft, in 1796 through 1797, and then it was revised at the beginning of the 19th century in 1811 through 1812, and it was published ultimately in 1813. It was Austen's second published novel after Sense and Sensibility. The novel takes place during the period of time in England known as the Regency period in the early 19th century. It tells the story of the Bennet family, 5 daughters born to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and it primarily follows the character development of protagonist Elizabeth Bennet, the second of 5 daughters, and her eventual relationship with the wealthy Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Elizabeth Bennet, in the course of the novel, learns about the consequences of her hasty judgments of others, her prejudices, if you will. And Mr. Darcy learns that his pride, his very haughty and aloof attitude toward others, and especially toward the Bennet family, and maybe most particularly toward Elizabeth Bennet, has not served him very well or won him many friends. Both of these characters have to overcome serious personality flaws in order to achieve any kind of real happiness in life. A central problem in the novel, presented at the very beginning, is that the Bennet property, the Longbourn estate, is entailed and can only be passed on to a male heir. Mr. Bennet has 5 unmarried daughters at the novel's opening, and his family runs the risk of being put out of their home if he should die, because the property will be passed on to a male relative. It becomes the mission of Mrs. Bennet to find suitable that is, wealthy, husbands for her 5 daughters, so that everyone will be taken care of in the future. While we do follow the efforts of Mrs. Bennet to find suitable partners for her daughters, though some truly have ideas of their own about this mission, we are primarily focused in the course of the novel on the tempestuous relationship that develops between the second eldest Bennet daughter, Elizabeth, and the wealthy Fitzwilliam Darcy. Jane Austen originally intended to call the novel First Impressions, and indeed this was always the focus of our early discussions of the novel as well in my AP English classes. While characters clearly form the wrong impressions of one another early on, we as readers would collect textual evidence to support our first impressions of all of the main characters as they are introduced in the first chapters. I would use this exercise of collecting evidence from the text to support our first impressions of characters as a way of studying both direct and indirect characterization. Namely, we would focus early on Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, on Elizabeth and Jane Bennet, on Fitzwilliam Darcy, and on Charles Bingley. Jane Austen also uses contrast as an important tool in characterization. We would look at how she often sets up very different characters in pairs, and how, through the use of contrast, she is able to show us what her characters are like. For example, we are introduced to Bingley and Darcy together. Both are successful men, but they are very different in background, temperament, personality, and attitudes that they evoke from others. So we would look at scenes where these two appear together as a way of coming to understand more about each character. Contrasts between Jane, the eldest Bennet daughter, and Lydia, the youngest, also help us to understand a great deal about the Bennet family as a whole. Similarly, Elizabeth Bennet and Caroline Bingley can be contrasted during the scene at Netherfield Park when Elizabeth comes to help while her sister Jane is there recuperating from an illness. In a recent video about his return to Jane Austen for the first time since he was in high school, my good friend Gavin at Genre Books talked about how the delightful humor of Jane Austen pretty much escaped him as a teenaged reader, and he's only just now, as an adult reader, discovering how funny Jane Austen really is. I think that Gavin's initial experience of reading Jane Austen is probably true for many teenagers, and that is why I always endeavored in my classes to emphasize the humor in Pride and Prejudice. Sometimes this would come from simply reading some of her characterizations out loud. For example, her characterization of the very presumptuous, pompous, and ridiculous heir to the Bennet estate, Mr. Collins. We would read his absurd proposal to Elizabeth Bennet as a great example of Jane Austen's humor. The guy is a complete buffoon. Showing some scenes from the various film versions also help 21st century teens to see the delightful humor in Jane Austen. Another focus of our discussions would be the use of the epistolary form in the novel. While this novel is not technically considered an epistolary novel, it does make abundant use of letter writing among the various characters as a way of furthering the narrative and developing characters. A great deal of the exposition of this novel is conveyed in letters between the various characters. In the course of the novel, we read letters between Caroline Bingley and Jane Bennet, between sisters Jane and Elizabeth Bennet, between Mr. Collins, the heir apparent, and Mr. Bennet, between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, between Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth Bennet, between sisters Lydia and Elizabeth Bennet, and many others. AP English literature requires that students be able to read a text closely and analyze things like word choice or diction, complexity of sentence structure, attitudes of the writer, style and tone. Studying the letters allows us to dig deeply into aspects of the writing style and characterization as well. One of the most difficult concepts to teach in AP English literature, and one of the most important, is the tone of a literary text. And it is a literary device that students are often required to write about in one or more of the required essays on the AP English literature exam. Jane Austen provides great opportunities for analyzing and writing about tone. Tone is a literary device that reflects the writer's attitude toward the subject matter in a literary work. Tone may also reflect the attitudes or feelings of a narrator or a particular character. The tone at various places in Pride and Prejudice is often critical, biting, or sarcastic. At times, Austen is presenting us with very foolish characters who have definite pretensions about social class, or they have limited ideas about gender roles, for example. We would practice analyzing passages for tone by annotating passages and responding to specific questions about how Austen was using description or dialogue or other particular literary devices in order to convey a specific tone. After annotating several passages, students also complete AP literature style essays where they are asked to write about the author's tone in a particular passage and to write about how tone also helps to communicate a particular theme. Analysis of the tone of such passages helps students to understand the deeper meanings that Austen is trying to communicate. Students would practice analyzing the tone of passages such as Mr. Darcy's first proposal to Elizabeth early in the novel, or Mr. Collins' very pompous and obnoxious proposal to Elizabeth, or Elizabeth's initial recognition that she has misjudged Mr. Darcy. They look at such things as the use of dialogue, diction, syntax, description, or any other literary device in order to come to an understanding of the overall meaning of the passage. We would also look at Pride and Prejudice in film and compare scenes from the various film versions. And sometimes we would also look at excerpts from Pride and Prejudice in popular culture. One year, our fall play at school was a theatrical adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. This was being directed by a colleague of mine and a very dear friend of mine in the English department. Almost the entire cast of the play was in my AP English class, and the rest of the class attended at least one night of the productions, so that we could discuss the play in class after production weekend. That year, my students had an especially deep understanding of Jane Austen and what made her a writer of such enduring importance. So that's a little bit about another beloved work that I loved to teach. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.